Welcome to a new episode of Policy Implications podcast, where policy meets research. I'm your host, Olga Zadorozhna from Kozminski University, where I teach and do research in empirical economics. After a short winter break, I'm finally back with a new podcast episode. My guest today is Katarina Pettersson, who is a professor at the University of Helsinki. Katarina's main area of expertise is nationalist and radical right-wing political rhetoric, political hate speech, and political communication and persuasion. Today, we'll be discussing her recent paper called Allied Political Discourse on Refugees and Asylum Seekers, the Language of Social Exclusion, co-authored with Martha Augustinos. This paper studies an anti-immigration discourse of far-right and centrist politicians and discusses the effect it has on the general public and its perception of immigrants. So welcome, Katarina. I'm very happy to have you on the podcast and be discussing this research with you. But before we start our discussion of the paper, please tell us more about your research and how did you become interested in this topic?
Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and talk about these not so happy topics. My interest in these issues dates back to my study times when I was studying social psychology and became interested in intergroup relations and nationalism and also the history of intergroup hatred and through this I was then sort of caught into I got interested in the role of language in these processes and how language actually plays a very important role in the development in the development of intergroup relations and how they can also become very, very bad. So that's how it all started, and then at this. The rise of far-right populism and nationalist movements throughout Europe some 10 years ago, then provided quite a natural means of studying these topics because it became such a timely topic in many countries and both societally and academically. So that's how I started working on political rhetoric and hate speech as well.
Great, and indeed, the language matters, as you said, and in your paper, you examine the anti-immigration discourse of politicians, different types of politicians. So why do you think it matters so much what they say? Does it affect the general perception of refugees and asylum seekers, the general public's perception, do you think?
I think it does. I mean, you can study this from many angles and see look from many perspectives on how political communication matters in people's everyday lives. But what it at least does is that this political discourse about immigration, about the nation, about us and them, it creates these identities, these common social identities for people. So politicians have very much power in defining who we are and who they are, and in creating this sense of togetherness, which can be good, but the sense of togetherness can also be used as a rhetorical tool to defend us against them, and in extreme cases to get rid of them or exclude them because they are a threat to us. And this is what happens in anti-immigration political discourse or hate speech against minorities. And then of course a very timely issue is the role of social media and how politicians nowadays they reach far beyond their immediate followers or supporters. They reach global transnational audiences and their rhetoric spreads to many levels of society through the social media and through that then further. So it's indeed powerful.
Yes, it is powerful and it divides people, unfortunately. So how does the presence of these far-right hate speech online and also offline affect the general discourse? Does it shift it more to the right, being just, so extreme? And could you please explain the mechanism behind it and how it happens in practice that this shift from, let's say, centrist rhetoric happens to be more right because of the hate speech online?
Yes, well, this is something that has, it's not a new phenomenon, unfortunately. It has happened before. And I think the troublesome, most troublesome thing about it, and what makes it so difficult, is that this change in the general discourse, in the general way that we in societies, we people talk about different groups of people, it happens very slowly. So this shift doesn't occur overnight, but it can occur, for example, if we would now look back at how we 10 or 15 years ago talked about minorities, talked about immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, we would see that what we say today would not have been okay then, or what politicians say today would not have been okay. But this shift happens slowly, and it goes unnoticed. But when you look at this timeline, then you see that it does indeed happen, and it. I mean, it's also, you can say that it's sort of a threshold that needs to be crossed. That if a statement has been uttered, something really discriminatory, hateful against a certain group of people, and perhaps at the moment not accepted, it could be condemned and frowned upon, but still when it has been said, it then shifts the general discourse. It lowers the threshold for it happening another time. And I think this is what we have seen, that the discourse of far-right movements, for example, it has become so influential due to their electoral support that it has started to affect the general political discourse, and also the general societal discourse.
Right. And what about the discourse on immigration coming from centrist politicians? Because they also have a lot of things to say about that. So how do they portray refugees and asylum seekers, and what connotation their rhetoric has? Do they contribute to the so-called normalization of more radical views?
Yeah, this is a very, very interesting question. And of course, we always have to remember that country contexts are different, and these developments take different shape depending on the country. But as a general response, the so-called mainstream parties do have to respond in some way, right? They have to take a stance on far-right discourse on immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees and so on. So what do they do? How do they react to this? Because it's such a powerful discourse, and it mobilizes us, the people, the national people. So they also have to do something so that they don't lose the voters. And then what has happened in quite many countries is that they have then started to adapt more moderate forms of this discourse. So they don't use explicit hate speech or explicit racist or racial claims, but they can actually use arguments about that, we have to be rational, we have to think about the good of our nation, our country, and our people, and we cannot let our welfare society collapse, for example, if too many people arrive. So they can use these kind of logical, so to say, arguments and these kind of self-evident claims about maintaining a democracy and maintaining a liberal society and defending the people. And they can also use the existence of far-right movements to do this. So they can say that in order to fight against extremism and not fall into this kind of polarizing discourse, we must now make sure that we take care of ourselves, so to say. And this is something that has become a general pattern, that we see that the far right discourse and the more centrist discourse is getting closer to each other, because they are nowadays, in many countries, they are equally powerful movements.
So we should be careful when we hear the centrist politicians saying that, okay, so we are rational and we need to take care of our economy, so we cannot let in more people from outside, because this is also a hidden racism maybe, and also the hidden message of we against them, right?
Yes, and the controversial issue is that these claims about about human rights and tolerance and liberalism and democracy, they can be used to actually do the opposite when it comes to certain groups of people. If you use these arguments as something that belongs to us, and we have to make sure that these are taken care of for our part, then somebody is excluded.
Yes, exactly. This exclusion, this is what happens basically when we do this, online or offline, saying things like that. Indeed, this is very important, I think, what you are saying. All right, so in your other paper on hate speech against Muslims, you discuss the boundaries between hate speech and freedom of speech. And a lot of people try to cover their racism and misogyny behind the freedom of speech free card, basically. So where is this boundary? Where does the freedom of speech ends and the hate speech begins?
I wish I could answer that question. Unfortunately, what makes it so difficult, this whole really politicized debate between freedom of speech and hate speech, is that there is no clear-cut boundary between them. It always is context dependent, and national legislation and also international definitions vary. So it's very difficult to give a straightforward answer to that, where to draw the boundary. But I think it is extremely important, especially when it comes to, when we talk about hate speech and political hate speech in particular, there are always power relations involved. So usually the hatred is directed from somebody at the top to somebody at the bottom when we talk about societal intergroup relations. So from the hate speech of a powerful politician, or what a powerful politician says about some fairly vulnerable minorities, such as refugees or asylum seekers or religious minorities, that becomes troublesome quite quickly, because this powerful politician has the means to actually mobilize people against these groups of people. So actually incite to hatred and even violence. So I think there is a big risk, and these cases should always be investigated very properly. At the same time as, of course, also politicians enjoy freedom of speech, and they should be allowed to talk about also difficult things. Immigration and these questions, they are hotly debated things, and they do pose challenges for societies, and this is something that needs to be debated, but it has to be done with still respecting the dignity of human beings and of groups of people.
Yes.
So yeah,
and with responsibility as well, because power is also responsibility before voters, before people of your nation, of your country, including the minority groups.
Yes. And what you said also about concealing hate speech, that's also a very big problem, right? It can be concealed behind the argument that I just used my free speech, I used my democratic right, and also it can be concealed behind humor. Often it's excused through the argument that I was only joking, and this concerns both hatred against ethnic and religious minorities, and also hatred against, for example, women.
Yes, that's true. I've seen a lot of stories about politicians actually saying that, yes, it was a joke and I didn't mean it, but then you said it, and there is responsibility for your words. That's so true. So we should be careful about that as consumers of information, I guess, and consume this information with a grain of salt and try to analyze. So what's actually, in those words, in those statements?
Yes, and that's not too easy to do.
Yes, it is not. But what are the main policy implications of your research? So what tools do we have to fight against this far-right hate speech or just hate speech? And how can we decrease polarization and make sure our societies are more tolerant towards immigrants and other minority groups?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, maybe the most important question. And I think that the answer is that there are many things should be done, and not legislation is one thing, perhaps the key thing, and very, very, very important, but it doesn't, I think it's not in itself enough, because we have, for example, seen that politicians, quite famous politicians who are prosecuted for hate speech, they don't necessarily suffer from this at all in a political sense, and their rhetoric doesn't change. But it can be actually quite the opposite, that they can use these sentences that they have gotten as a sort of martyr label, that you know, I am still going to defend my country and my people, no matter how many times I am prosecuted. So legislation in itself is very important. It's important that it keeps up to date, also in the online context when it comes to online hate speech. But in itself, it's not enough, because it demands efforts from the whole of society. So media, for example, have a big responsibility in how they report about these issues, whose views are taken into consideration, and how. Here again, power relations are important. And then I think another aspect, what you just tapped into, was also that we need to think about the long-term, the preventive work. So how to keep up a dialogue between different levels of society, so between politicians and decision makers on one hand, and then grassroots movements and ordinary people on the other. So it's in order to prevent polarization, it's important that people feel that they are heard and their needs are taken into consideration and taken seriously, because otherwise these needs and worries, they turn into frustration and hatred and even radicalization. So I think this long-term thinking about these issues and how to deal with them is important. And in terms of that, it's also, I think, education, I think schools and young people, children in general, and how to prepare them for this world where you face hate speech if you go online, which everybody does. How to prepare them for this and how to help them become literate when it comes to detecting it, and how to seek help and so on. I think there are many levels at which we have to respond to this challenge.
Yes, for sure. And I think these methods that you talked about, they are very important, and they are really in need to be implemented. And I think things are going forward with this implementation, because I can see that things are a bit different when it comes, for example, to education. And we have lots of different kinds of literature for young adults, for children, that explains, you know, what is racism and what is hate speech, what is bullying, and how to behave when you encounter these things. So things are moving, but do you think they're moving slow, or maybe they are at the right pace?
I think I agree with you that they are moving, and I think that we that's the most important thing, and that we should make sure that it stays like this. I think it's challenging because the involvement and the transformations also of the social media and how they can be used and for what ends, it changes so rapidly that I think there's a fear that we become too comfortable just because we have reacted. We have to keep reacting. So I think, but it's important to stay optimistic, and I really want to do that. I think it's also necessary.
Yes, I think so too. And I am optimistic. And I think, you know, even having these discussions that we are having, they're so important, because our listeners will also talk about these issues and maybe discuss what we are saying and maybe contribute to this discussion. And then because we are talking and the society is talking, then the society also improves as a result. It goes from, you know, not talking about these issues, not meeting those issues, to kind of like, you know, thinking about them and discussing them. So hopefully the next time we meet or discuss these issues, we will be on a completely different level of understanding and the discussion, and maybe there will not be that much hate speech online anymore.
Let's hope. I agree with you. A discussion to keep it up is important, and these trends tend to go as trends. They tend to go up and down historically. So we can hope that we are now going towards better times.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Katarina, for an interesting discussion. And yes, let's stay optimistic.
Yes, thank you.